In this video, we'll be going over the basic setup process to start working with Babylon with TypeScript inside of Vue 3. We'll learn how to create a Babylon TypeScript class to build a simple 3D scene that contains a camera, a hemispheric light, a sphere, and a ground object. We'll then connect that to a Vue component to be displayed on the front end. So with that said, let's jump in and let's get started. Okay, so we're in Visual Studio Code. I have an empty folder in here called Babylon 101. And from here, we're going to create a Vue project. The easiest way to do this is by using the Vue CLI. So I do have the Vue CLI already installed. If you want to install it yourself, you can run npm I, so that's short for install, npm I-g global at vue/CLI. Now, once you have that installed, you can run vue-version, and this will pull up the version of the CLI that you're using. Now, once you have that set up, you can then create a Vue project. So let's go and do that now. We'll say Vue create, and here we provide a name. I'm going to go with B101. Hit enter. Okay, so once you see these options here, I do want to use Vue with TypeScript, but I don't need the router or Vuex. So I'm going to manually select the features I want. I use the down arrow on my keyboard to move down. Now from here, we need to make sure that we select TypeScript. So use the space bar to select it, go down to TypeScript, use the space bar, select it, and then hit enter. I'll be using Vue 3, so hit enter. I'm not going to be using the class style component syntax. I'll press N for that. And I'm not going to be using Babel alongside TypeScript. I'll press no. And then I'll be using the ESLint with error prevention only. Lint on save is fine. And in dedicated config files is fine. And I don't want to save this as a preset, so I'll press no. Okay, so give this a few moments to install. Okay, so once that completes, you should see something similar to this. So we have cd into the name of the project, and then npm run serve. So I'll use Control L to clear this out. So let's first cd into our project called B101. And then we're going to run npm run serve. Okay, so once that compiles, we should see something that looks like this. I use Control click to left click on localhost 8080. This will open up in a tab in our browser. So you should see something similar to this. All right, so let's take a look at what else we need for this project. Minimize this. I need to install the Babylon package as well. We are going to be using a number of different Babylon packages and other packages as well. But for now, we're just going to start off with the core package of Babylon. So let's go and stop this. Control C. And we're going to run npm I at BabylonJS/core. This will install the TypeScript version of BabylonJS, which we'll be using. Okay, once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and clear this out once again. And we're going to jump into our folder here. And what I want to do is actually modify one of the components. So let's just take care of the Vue side first. And then we'll take a look at creating the actual TypeScript files from the Babylon side. So if we open up the source folder, go into components, you should see hello world. We're going to be reusing the same component, but we're going to rename it to BabylonExamples. So let's rename it now. And from here, we can take a look at the component itself. Now we are going to get a warning because we are using hello world in the app. We'll take a look at that in a moment. But the reason why I want to use Vue is because Vue is very easy to understand from a beginner perspective. So even if you have no experience using these kind of frameworks, we can see that we have very clearly defined sections of a Vue component. At the very top, we typically have the HTML in the component. So this is straight HTML. And down below that, we have the script section. So all of this is going to be written in TypeScript and JavaScript. And then down below that, we have some scoped styles. So this is where all the CSS is going to go. Now, scope means that this is going to be specific to this one component. So we're going to be modifying this quite a bit. So up here, I don't need all this HTML. I'm going to take everything from the divs on up. So everything in between these two divs, I'll delete it. And we're going to replace that with a couple of things. So first off, let's create a div. I'm going to have an H3 in there. And we're going to say Babylon examples in the H3. And then down below that, we're going to use something called a canvas. The canvas element will be used with our Babylon projects. So the canvas element will be empty, but we are going to reference it down below in our script section. So let's jump down to the script section. I'll do a quick save just to format. And in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the name here with the name of the file. So Babylon Examples. We're no longer using props, so we'll remove that for now. And instead, we're going to replace that with a mounted function. Now, mounting gets called whenever this component is first mounted. Now, don't worry if you don't understand that. We're not going to go too in depth with the Vue side. Just follow along and add in what I add in here. So mounted is case sensitive, so make sure that you write it out as such. And whenever this component gets mounted, I then want to grab my canvas element. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to store that in a variable, and we're going to use document.querySelector to grab it. So I'll create a const variable called canvas, and I'll set that equal to document.querySelector. Now I'll pass in the name of the selector that I want. That is going to be canvas. And that's about it for now. We are going to be using this in a moment down below with an instance of a Babylon class. We haven't created that class yet, so we're going to leave this as is. But let's also go back into our app.vue. Right now, this is looking for a component called Hello World. We're not using Hello World. We're using Babylon Examples. So let's rename that. I'm no longer using the prop of message, so let's remove that as well. We'll remove the image at the very top. And then down below here, what I'm going to do is actually select this, use Control D to select the component name as well. And I'll say Babylon Examples. Okay, this is coming from the correct place. So components, BabylonExamples.vue. Now we have everything set up. So let's give this a quick test. Let's jump back into the server itself. So again, npm run serve. Okay, now you will get this warning here that says canvas is assigned a value but never used. And that's perfectly fine. We are going to be using it in a moment. But let's just make sure that we actually see what we need from the component itself. So going back into the browser, you can see we just have Babylon Examples at the very top. We do have a canvas in here, but we're not actively using it yet, so we won't actually see anything. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize this. Now we can go back and we can create our Babylon class. I'm going to stop the server. Now in our SRC folder, we're going to create a folder for all the Babylon classes. So right click on SRC, new folder, and Babylon Examples. Now within this folder, we're going to contain all the TypeScript files. So we're going to try to keep this as abstract and as organized as possible. I don't like to mix and match a whole lot of stuff. So whenever possible, I like to keep my classes separate from the components and vice versa. Now in the Babylon Examples, we're going to create a basic scene TypeScript file. So right click new file. And I'm going to create basic scene.ts. Note the naming convention here, capital B, capital S. I'll be using the same naming convention for class names and method names as well. All right, so in our basic scene, I want to create a class. So we'll say export class basic scene. And within this class, we're going to create a constructor. The constructor gets called automatically whenever we create an instance of any class. This constructor can be used for providing starting values for a class. So in our case, we actually want to use the constructor to grab the canvas element that we created in the component. So let's start off by writing out constructor. And note this is a built-in method, if you will. So this has a lowercase c. Now we can provide arguments or parameters to this constructor. So in this case, it's going to be called canvas. So that is the name of the argument. And then we're going to have HTML canvas element as the type. Now, by providing the parameter like this to the constructor, it's only accessible within the constructor. If I want to use that for whatever reason in other methods, I will need to provide an access modifier. So to do that, I'm just going to write out private. Now, in the constructor, we're going to set up a couple of different things. For a Babylon scene to work, we need an engine and we also need a scene. So the engine powers everything while the scene is kind of like the level. So we're going to add in things like cameras, lights, so on and so forth. So right above the constructor itself, I'm going to declare a couple of variables. So the first one is going to be called scene, which will be of type scene. Now, one thing to note, you'll see that I am typing out a type here, and sometimes you'll see this pop up here. Sometimes you'll actually see the type that you want, in which case you can then select it and have it automatically imported. In my case, I'm not actually seeing the scene that I want, so I'm going to have to manually import this myself, which is perfectly fine. So at the very top, I'm going to import, and I'm going to import a few things. So I want to import scene and then engine. Note that they are both uppercase from, and I'm getting these from BabylonJS core. Okay, so now I can use the scene type right here, and there it is. And do note, since we are using TypeScript, if I don't assign a value to this right away, it is going to complain if I don't provide the type. So like this, we need to provide a type. Below that, I'm also going to create an engine with a lowercase e, and this will be the engine type. So we're going to create those in our constructor. Let's start off with the engine first. So this.engine equals new engine, and we need to provide the canvas. That is really the only necessary thing that we need for the engine. But I'm also going to be using the anti-alias. This is a Boolean, either true or false. And anti-aliasing is just going to help us to kind of smooth out jagged edges around 3D objects. So let's pass in this.canvas, and then I'll say true for the anti-aliasing. Okay, below that, we're going to create the scene. Now, the scene is going to contain a number of different things. I don't want to have too much in my constructor. So what I'm going to do is actually create a separate method for everything in our scene. And then I'm going to assign it to this.scene. So what I'm going to do here is say this.scene equals, and I haven't created this yet, but we're going to say this.createScene. This will be a method that returns a scene type with everything already attached. So note the naming convention here again. Let's create that down below. So create scene. And with the scene, we're going to provide a type that we're going to be returning, which is of type scene. Now, one thing to note about TypeScript with these kind of type definitions here, if you don't provide a type like this and you return a certain type, it's automatically going to infer what type you're trying to return. So you don't actually need this here in the method names. For stuff like this as well, where you're assigning something directly, it automatically infers what type it's getting. So it's not going to complain if you don't provide a type for that variable name. But for method names, I like to go with this consistency of providing the type that we're returning, whether that's void or some other type. So in my case, I'm returning a scene. So in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable, which will be a local variable to this method for a scene, and we're going to pass in the engine into that. So const scene equals new scene. And notice that this is a class, and this class requires an engine. So this.engine. Now everything else is optional, so I don't need that. And now it's going to complain because we haven't returned this yet. So I'm going to return scene. Okay, there we go. Now we have an actual scene. There's nothing in it yet, but we do have a scene. Now there are a few other things we need in here. So right below this.scene, I want to ensure that I'm running the engine and then I'm rendering the scene. So we're going to use something called the render loop. So this.engine.run render loop. This takes in a function. We're going to use an arrow function for this. And every time this runs through the loop, what do we want to do? Well, we want to render the scene. This is going to be important as we start working with things like animations or anything that moves. You want something to be constantly updated so we always get the freshest look of whatever we're rendering in that specific scene. So I'm going to say this.scene.render. Just like that. Now again, we don't have anything in here, but I do want to see how this works on the front end. We will still see something on the front end, but we won't see really much. But I just want to make sure that we do have a connection between the Babylon scene and the front end. Let's take a look at how that would work. Let's go back into our components. So we're going to go into Babylon examples. And in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to import that class. So basic scene. And you can see right away, I do get this kind of like IntelliSense. So I'm importing this from BabylonExamples basic scene. Now we're going to be using that down below in the mounted. And since I'm not actually accessing anything within basic scene, I'm not referencing different methods or properties, I'm just going to say new basic scene. And you'll see that it needs a canvas. So it's going to complain unless we provide a canvas. Now, if you hover over the canvas as we provide this is kind of a weird TypeScript thing, but sometimes it doesn't know whether or not something is going to be null. So one way to get around that over here is by adding in an exclamation point at the very end. This is like kind of saying like, I know this is not going to be null. It is going to be assigned, so don't worry about that. You could also say if canvas, and then you can call this, but that's a quick and easy way to do that. Just add an exclamation point at the very end there. And now we know that we are always going to have something for canvas. All right, so let's go and save this. And now let's go back into the terminal and let's run this. Okay, so here it is in the browser. As you can see here, we do have this little purple box. That is the canvas. That's what we're actually getting from Babylon. But this is way, way too small. So let's go to modify the CSS to make this quite large. We want the size to be about 70% of the screen size. So let's jump back into the component. So here I'm in the component itself. And down below here, we're not using any of these right here. We can actually remove them. And I want to modify the canvas. So we're just going to use basic CSS. So canvas. And I want to adjust the width and the height. Okay, so the width and height will be 70% and 70%. Go ahead and save that and go back to your browser. And there we go. Now we have a nice looking canvas. All right, so we do have a canvas working. Everything is connected up properly, but we need to actually see something in here. So we're going to add in a camera, a light, and a couple of 3D objects in here to finish off this basic scene. Let's jump back into our basic scene. And in the create scene method, we're going to add in a few new things. First off, let's start off with the camera. The camera is kind of like the eyes in our environment. So I'm going to create a camera called camera, and I'll set that equal to a new free camera. And I'm going to let the IntelliSense here allow me to import this automatically. So we're going to be using free camera from BabylonJS core. Now we need to provide a name. I'll name it camera. We need to provide a starting position. So where do we want to place this in the world? This is a vector 3. Now a vector 3 is the X, Y, and Z axis. In this case, I want the camera to be a little bit above the ground, but I want it to be in the center point of the world. So we need to say new vector 3. And I'll say 0 for the X. We're going to go with a value of 1 for the Y and 0 for the Z axis. Okay, lastly, we need to actually provide this to the scene. So we need to say, hey, I want you to attach this to this scene. Okay, now down below that, if we want to actually control the camera with the mouse, we can use camera.attachControl. Okay, so now we can move the camera around with our mouse. Now we have the camera, let's add in a couple other things. So the camera is only going to work if we can actually see something in our environment. So we need to add in a light and a couple of 3D objects to actually determine whether or not there's actually something in our environment. So let's add in the light first. Now there are different types of lights, just like there are different types of cameras. So the light we're going to be using is called a hemispheric light. I'm going to call it Hemi light. And this will be equal to a new hemispheric light. Okay, so make sure that you use hemispheric light, not hemisphere builder, hemispheric light. And this also requires a name. I'll call it Hemi light. And note the vector 3 here is a direction. It's not a position. With a hemispheric light, it doesn't matter where you place it in the world. All that really matters is the direction it's pointing in. A hemispheric light is used for fill lighting in our environment. So typically for this, I like to go with a positive 1 along the y-axis. We'll say new vector 3, just like above. 0, 1, 0. And then again, we're going to provide the scene that we want to attach this to. So this dot scene. Now by default, the hemispheric light is going to be a little bit bright. So we can adjust the properties of the intensity of that light. Down below that, we'll say Hemi light dot intensity. And intensity is a number. By default, I believe it's at a value of 1. So if we go with 0.5, that should reduce it by half. Okay, so now we have some light. Now we need some actual 3D objects. we're going to create a ground and a sphere object to actually display some sort of 3D object in our environments. So we'll start off with the ground first. We'll call it ground. And this will be equal to something called mesh builder dot create ground. Now it's going to complain here because I haven't actually imported this. So again, I went a little bit too quick with this. Let's see if we can actually import this automatically. So there it is. Hit enter. Or you can again go to the very top here and just import it directly. All of these come from BabylonJS core. Okay, so mesh builder dot, and then we have create ground. So this will essentially create a plane on the floor. This will be our ground object. We'll name it ground. And this has slightly different options. So with this being a plane object, we can provide the width and the height. And that's all I'm going to provide for this. So for the width, let's go with a value of 10. And then the height, we'll go with a value of 10 as well. And in this case, you can see we don't actually need to provide the scene. I am going to provide it, but in this case, you can see the question mark here. It says, hey, it's not really necessary. Okay, and you'll notice that we don't have any actual options in here for actually modifying the starting position of where this ground is at. By default, this will be at 0, 0, 0. This will be at the center point of the world. If you want to place this somewhere else, you can actually do this after the fact, but we'll take a look at how we can reposition an object with the sphere down below. So we have the ground. Now I want to create a sphere that's above the ground, similar to how we have this set up with the camera. So down below that, we're going to say const, and I'm going to call this ball. So this will be equal to mesh builder as well. And we're going to create a sphere. So create sphere. We'll call it ball. And in this case, if we scroll through here, all I'm going to provide here is the diameter. You can also adjust these segments if you want it to be a little bit smoother. So the segments are basically kind of like the rings around the sphere. In my case, I'm just concerned with the diameter. So we're going to add that in. And I'm just going to go with a value of 1 and see how big that is. Add this to the scene, so this dot scene. All right, so with our ground and the ball, both of these are going to be exactly at the same point, which means that the ball is going to look like it's intersecting with the ground. I don't want that. So I want the ball to be above the ground. So the way I can modify this is after I create it, I can say ball.position, and there are a few ways to adjust the position. The first method here is for providing a value for the X, Y, and Z. You can also modify the individual axis values, but let's just start off with the ball.position. If I hover over ball.position, this is a vector 3. So I need to provide a vector 3 for this as well. I'll set that equal to a new vector 3. And the vector 3 here, I want to keep it in the middle of the world, but I want it to be above the ground. So I'll go with 0, 1, 0. Now the other method is by using ball.position. And then if you want to adjust one of the axis values, let's say the x-axis, I can do that and then provide a single number like 1, 10, whatever it was. But I'm just going to use the one that I have right now. Okay, give that a quick save. All right, so we have everything set up here. I think we're ready to go now. So let's go and give this a quick test. I did have my server running this whole time, so we should see it appear in our scene. Okay, so if you refresh, you will see that we see the plane. And if I move my mouse around, so you have to left click in the canvas and then move around, you can see, you can move around, but where is the sphere? Well, one of the kind of weird things about the camera is that it also starts off at the center point. So in order for us to actually see the sphere, we need to move the camera back. So let's take a look at how we can do that. Go back into our code. So right now the camera is at 0, 1, 0. The ball is also at that position. Now, if you're not familiar with how 3D works, the inner portion of a mesh is typically not rendered unless we specify that we want that rendered. So if the camera is inside of the ball, it's going to look like we don't actually see anything at all in terms of the ball itself. So we can either move the ball or move the camera. I'm going to go ahead and move the camera. So in this case, if we go back into our scene real quick, if I'm going forward this way, that is a positive z-axis. So if I want to move back behind the sphere, I want to use a negative value for the z-axis. So let's use that value. So going back into the free camera, we have the x, the y, and the z. So for the z-axis, let's go with a value of -5. I'm going to save this. And there we go. Now we have our ball within Vue. And you can see it's above the ground. It's a little bit hard to tell from this angle, but it is above the ground. I can look around and you can see the size of the plane, and we have our sphere. All right, so now we have a basic understanding of how a basic BabylonJS scene will work with TypeScript and Vue. In subsequent lessons, we're going to go over adding in textures, using imported models, things of that sort.